Welcome everyone to the second webinar of Transforming Construction Network Plus. I'm Andy Davies, and I'll be chairing today's session. But before I do that, I'd like to say a few words about the network. Transforming Construction Network Plus aims to stimulate the participation, facilitate collaboration, and encourage the exploration of ideas that will stimulate the transformation of the UK construction sector. Network Plus unites construction, academic and industrial communities to create a new research and knowledge base dedicated to addressing the problems that are facing the sector. It's a 2-year funded grant, and really it's about building collaboration between academics and industry in really important research topics that will help facilitate the transformation. And there are 3 key institutions that are involved, universities involved, 3 partner universities: UCL, Imperial College, and Warwick Manufacturing Group. The network is led by Professor Jackie Glass at UCL, and if you want more information, please do check the website address on this slide here. Just to move on from that, yeah. So, the idea of this is funded by the UK Research and Innovation body, and it also receives Industrial Strategy Challenge funding. So the government has given funding to support the development and transformation of the UK industry. And we are really trying to find out what kind of research will help to achieve that. So university scholars are working with practitioners to actually find out what are the key levers for change that will enable the industry to transform. And I think there's 4 main areas. Again, you can see this on our website. But the idea, and these are to quote our kind of objectives, that Network Plus is to provoke, enable, and amplify innovation through 4 main objectives. One is the development of knowledge, and to actually facilitate our understanding of what's needed in terms of research and development, changes in government policy. We will also be doing community building, and we've had a lot of initiatives and events already to actually build a knowledge exchange and start to develop a kind of a network of collaborators within the sector between academics and industrial partners. We are trying to identify what are the new business models that will transform the sector, and in terms of design, manufacturing, assembly, and the operation of buildings and infrastructure. And the idea is also to have an investment and a legacy. This is a 2-year grant, but we want to leave behind, this is not something that will end. We intend to leave a legacy that this will enable a kind of a transformation that will be ongoing, and that will be based around the collaborations that we put in place. Okay. One thing before we move on is just that we are producing what we call these industry digests, and there will be a number of them. And the first one is changing business models, and we're looking at the implications for construction. So they're kind of user industrial friendly, trying to avoid too much academic jargon, short pieces of work that I think are really kind of useful for understanding. And the first one is about changing business models. So it talks about the key features of what is a business model, and you can download that from our website. So now to introduce today's webinar. The previous webinar was very much about an engineering view, engineering scholars Daniel Hall and Wei Pan talking about the kind of transformation of business models for off-site construction. Today's webinar is going to be much more of a kind of using 2 management scholars, leading management scholars, Dr. Sam MacAulay and Dr. Lena Bygballe, will be talking about the management or organisational aspects of the business of industrial transformation. So we're going to see a different lens, a different way of thinking about the kind of challenges that the industry faces, and this will be very much an international perspective. So Sam will be talking, he has experience, he worked in the UK in the academic sector, but also, and he'll tell you a little bit more about that. Now is back in Sydney, and he'll give a kind of his view, international view, drawing upon different examples. Lena, very much rooted in Norway, will look at the kind of the transformations that they face in terms of government, industry, and so on. And I think they will be very instructive and important for us to look at and understand the kind of transformations that we will face in the UK. Okay, so I'd like to just hand it over to Sam MacAulay to give us the first presentation. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks very much, Andy, and thanks to everybody who's tuning in at this early hour over there in London. All of those of you out there who are working to transform the construction industry for tuning in and listening to what we've got to say. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments afterwards. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking a little bit about the ways I see the trend towards Industry 4.0 transforming the way value is created and captured. And I think that's crucial, because if you can't capture the value that you create, you don't have a competitive advantage, and you're going to end up on the normal profit margins that we see in the construction industry, right? We want you to be doing better than that, because if you can't do better than that, it's not sustainable. So where are some of my thoughts coming from? I spend a lot of my time teaching at UTS and internationally around strategy and innovation in project-based firms. I've also spent a lot of time doing research. This has ranged from large infrastructure projects, looking at how they deliver innovation, so Crossrail, I3P, Thames Tideway, through to large global oil and gas and mining companies, and look at how they go about delivering innovations. To sort of take me everywhere from London to the jungles in Indonesia to down the road here in Sydney. So I want to draw on some of this stuff today, combine it with some of the conversations I've been having with leading practitioners over the last couple of years to bring you some sort of, hopefully, thoughts that will stimulate some thinking regards to the way, if you're a researcher, the way you're thinking about the world, and if you're a practitioner, how you guys are going about thinking about creating value through innovation, and also trying to figure out different ways you might try and capture some of that value for your own business and for the industry in general. So first up, I think the key thing that I want to focus on here is how the changes we're seeing around Industry 4.0 are driving fast, low cost, high fidelity simulation, analysis, and prediction. I think if you're interested in looking at where that's going to happen next, so looking at mass customization, autonomous construction, I'd highly recommend checking out my colleague Daniel Hall's talk on the last one of these webinars. It's very informative on that. For this one, I want to focus in on this first point here and look at how that might actually change the way value gets created, and then the trends for how it gets captured. But I don't want to talk about this in an abstract way. I want to give you something sort of tangible so you can understand what I'm really talking about here. So give you 4 different examples around how this sort of innovation might vary. I think it's useful to change the way we conceptualize innovation from just being, one distinct thing, it's innovative or not, to start thinking through some of the dimensions involved. So it might, vary between things that are radical or incremental, so totally revolutionary versus a small, step down the road, and things that might influence one function versus completely transform the value chain. Some examples here, we've got these things of reality. So we've got real-time safety monitoring by AI, and we've got AI-driven generative design. We're now seeing people like Autodesk start embedding generative design algorithms into their software. And then we're seeing really exciting things like design automation. So our colleagues at Stanford have a really interesting paper out in one of the civil engineering journals looking at different approaches for this model of Katera's process there. So we can actually automate design, which gets your design model and your cost and production models working together and rapidly allows you to explore right up and down different configurations of production, right up and down the value chain. We've also got something a bit more incremental. So we've been, the UK has been a leader in BIM for a long time, and we've seen, really nice incremental steps around BIM getting better and better. I think about Jennifer White's work, a colleague of mine, in that space, and that's something that once again is really starting to transform the value chain, reconfigure how people work with each other, from small firms right through to big ones. So these are some of the changes that I'm thinking about, and I think that they're really important because they're going to fundamentally change the way firms like yours create value for stakeholders. So I want to zoom in on 3 of these based on the research that I've done and my colleagues have done. So I think the first one here is that non-human agents will rapidly be able to co-create solutions that are unlikely to be conceived by humans alone. So I think it's really important here is co-create. So you're not going to have algorithms by themselves. Things like design automation aren't likely to be able to create value on their own, but you're going to need people who can work with them. Now, not only is this useful because you can generate lots of alternatives that you can explore, but it generates alternatives that you, in the way that our existing cognitive models, our ways of seeing the world, wouldn't come up with yourselves. We've seen examples of this years ago with Zaha Hadid's work, but there's also emerging examples where people are taking algorithms that are used for genetic algorithms for generating different cellular structures and applying them in an experimental sort of way to look at how you might change floor plans in office buildings. So another one coming from some of my research is thinking through how the way this technology can enable stakeholders to digitally construct like high fidelity shared representations of what value is through what I call playful engagement. Now, I was looking at this in the mining industry and how a firm that was looking to enter this new section of the mining industry, provide a new service to their clients, they started off trying to do this in traditional ways by sitting down, sending emails to clients, having coffees, having chats, building up tender documents, sending the tender documents, and this fell flat on its face. The clients had really had a hard time wrapping their head around the type of value this firm was trying to create. So what they did is they sat down, they built a very simple but high fidelity simulation model that they could both, the client and the firm, sit down and play with and retune together. Now, that was an amazing transformation and breakthrough. All of a sudden, you've got a model through which two different stakeholders can come together, interact in a high fidelity environment and rapidly prototype different types of value propositions, but also make certain assumptions that you might have about how the model might work a lot more transparent and tactile for a client who otherwise may not be highly technically competent. Because anytime you're coming up with a new service or a new product, there's many different types of value propositions you might want to focus on for different sorts of audiences. So this enables you to actually sit down and playfully explore what they might be. A very different way of relating than just sending each other tender documents. A recent example I had of this, where I was sitting around in a virtual world at a startup here in Sydney and exploring, the way they use this technology. And what I could do is I could actually sit down in this building, right, and have a real life whiskey and watch how the sun would set and how it would reflect off different types of bits of architecture in the building, ranging from the windows and how they are cut and how they are shaded, through to the blinds that you put up and all sorts of different combinations. So you really get this immersive and interesting experience you can start playing with in a virtual world instead of having to build it. So I think that's transformational. So the third, and maybe one of the most, probably the most important, I think, is it enables you to construct high fidelity predictive models that enable you to get diverse communities to come together and converge on justifications required for radical innovation. So my colleagues Mark Dodgson, David Gann and Eamon Salter did a really interesting study of fire engineering a few years ago where they really broke ground in this area, and I think it's incredibly relevant as this technology, the simulation and prediction technology, starts diffusing across all sorts of applications. What they were looking at was after September 11, a lot of people in Canary Wharf actually got a little bit concerned about how they might evacuate these large towers in the case of a terrorist attack or some other calamity. They worked together with Arup to sit down and start applying fire engineering models to come up with different solutions for evacuating these buildings. And one of them that they quite liked based on the models was using the elevator to evacuate people from high-rise buildings. The challenge was that everyone was very skeptical of whether this would work. What sitting down with the model enabled people to do is make assumptions a lot more transparent about how this would work. And since it was high fidelity and predictive, provide different stakeholders with some confidence around whether this might actually work or not. So I think that's another way we can actually use this. So you can come up with really radical, norm-challenging innovations around design and engineering, and you don't have to actually build them to convince these stakeholders they should give you a chance and let them work. I think this is a real challenge in engineering. Is often people ask you, they want to see evidence that something's worked before, right? In the real world. And if you can't show them that it hasn't worked in the real world, you get told to come back when you can. So I think this shift towards high fidelity predictive models offers a lot of opportunities for innovation. So I think we can sort of summarize this in two main points. I think for the implications, so the value of capabilities that firms have involving human calculation and memory are going to fall, and the value of capabilities involved judgment, negotiated interpretation with diverse stakeholder groups are going to rise. However, I think I don't think that's very debatable, right? I think it's fairly clear cut. I think not many people argue with the fact that the base of value creation is going to change. But as I said earlier on, competitive advantage depends not only on creating that value, but by inhibiting others from imitating it. And it's really not clear yet how this is going to play out. As we shift what these technologies are doing, they are enabling us to articulate and codify our knowledge and institutionalize it in the technology, right? And what that does is make it much more vulnerable to appropriation by our rivals. An interesting place to look at this once again is in mining, where they've made massive strides towards the automation of mining haul routes. So you can now have vehicles that autonomously drive around sites, and the routines that drive these things are codified. Whereas previously, you'd have a grizzly old operator who'd know from years of experience and diverse crunchings of diverse data how you might try to optimize this haul route. Now all this knowledge is being codified and improved in software. So what this does is actually leave you very much open to somebody misappropriating it. So back when it was just, good ideas got around on two legs or in big heavy vehicles like this, it's very hard to see how your competitive advantage might walk out the door or be hacked out the door by rivals. The same can't be said now when you've actually digitalized this into a tool that can, for better or worse, be copied and pasted. I see the same trend coming for construction. There's a sort of point where you ask is, who's got a chief information security officer? Now, this isn't a new thing. What we see every time there's new technologies that enable us to articulate and codify knowledge in different ways, there's always these value capture challenges. So this ranges from rapid copying of maps, when people started producing maps and being able to reliably print and copy them, through to blueprints. And what we saw with maps is the evolution of strategies for protecting the copyright called trap streets. Really interesting if you want to go read up on that. Essentially what you do is you go and insert fake streets so that you'll be able to identify if somebody is illicitly breaching your copyright. Because otherwise you could just say, I've been out there surveying the same streets as you, and you can't prove that, you essentially like saying, I developed this algorithm by myself, prove that I stole it off you, or copied it illegally, hacked into your computer and stole it. Blueprints, the same thing. What we actually started seeing when blueprinting technology came about was inventors started getting really worried about the fact they codified all this knowledge about how to build a device, and that somebody could come in, take it off them, and rapidly blueprint and copy it. So what they started doing was embedding errors into their blueprints, so that if somebody did steal the blueprint, they'd have a hard time replicating the process that it described. So I think this is really important now because imitation is getting a lot easier. So we've got essentially these codification replication machines. So we've got digitalization of manuals for equipment. We've got 3D printing, laser scanning, photography, videography. And this enables us to codify stuff and easily transfer stuff that was impossible previously. We've also got emerging challenges where you've got big differences around the world with how intellectual property rights are actually protected and perceived about whether they're legitimate or not. So what do companies do? So the traditional mechanisms that they use for actually inhibiting imitation and gaining competitive advantage, we can sort of lump these into three things. So one's economic. So for example, you invest in complementary assets. So Laing O'Rourke's factories are a good example of this. You don't just go out and say, hey, I do digital engineering. Just like Laing O'Rourke, you sort of, depending on what you're producing, you sort of need to own the factory too. The factory is a key part of your competitive advantage, and it's very expensive and complicated and difficult to imitate. There's obviously legal mechanisms like patents, trademarks, trade secrets, employee conduct rules, such as whether you can, you sign non-compete agreements and stuff like that. But there's been lots of academic research into this, and what that universally suggests is that patents, trademarks, copyrights are usually a pretty poor way to protect intellectual property. They're not very strong. Employee conduct rules are sometimes far too successful, but that's another story. There's also an interesting stream of research looking at social norms. So this is the way people like chefs protect their recipes and clowns protect their face paint. So it's essentially a community gets together and they have social sanctions that are enforced against people when they breach the norms for when you can appropriate a piece of knowledge or not. Now, what I see coming in this new era where everything, from photographs to videography to copy and paste becomes a lot easier because of digitization, is there's going to be an increasing emphasis on what my colleague Dmitry Sharapov and I at Imperial College call design mechanisms. So these are ways you distort, change, add to the manifestation of your knowledge in order to protect or inhibit other people from imitating it. Now, these things have been around for a long time. Trap streets are one example that I gave you before. There's examples of companies who do modular production in boats, who design their algorithms to delete themselves after they've executed. There was a really neat example recently where Google got caught plagiarizing song lyrics. This website called Lyrics Hero. So what they did was they were serving these lyrics up to the public. When they searched for them, Lyrics Hero said, "Hey, you're stealing our lyrics." They said, "Prove it." So what these guys did was they inserted little, commas and apostrophes into these lyrics, so they'd spell out Morse code caught red-handed if Google just copied and pasted it in the same way, right? So they proved that and shamed them on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And what you're also seeing with video, the emergence of telescopic lenses, satellite imaging, and high definition video, is companies that actually go through important processes such as launching a TBM are taking steps to cover, conceal these processes that they're executing in rather clever and interesting ways. So I think this is the new frontier in thinking about how you might actually go about protecting knowledge. And the key takeaway message for me is that Industry 4.0 is changing the way value is created and captured. And I ask you to think about what are you changing. So thanks a lot. Look forward to your questions, comments, and yeah, feel free to get in touch if you've got any others.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam. That was great. A really thought-provoking talk. And I just want to ask people to, if you would like to start asking your questions, you can type them in. If you just write your name, your title, and your organisation and your question, and I'm sure you'll have questions for Sam and for Lena, but you can start to do that now. So, Lena, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. And as Sam here was saying, I'm very delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for listening. I will follow up from Sam's presentation and new business models and new ways of creating value and capturing value. It requires organizational change processes, and that will be the key topic of my speech here. So the title is Transforming Organizational Practices in Construction. And what I will do is, first of all, I will just a brief introduction of myself and the Center for the Construction Industry at my school, BI Norwegian Business School. Just a couple of words of what we are doing. And then I will go further on to say a bit about what's the situation in the Norwegian construction sector. We have some nice initiatives. We have some more or less nice challenges that these initiatives try to cope with. And I think there are some both similarities, but also obviously some differences between the Norwegian sector and the UK sector. And then I will go further and say, well, what is the problem and how can we approach it when it comes to transforming organizational practices? So I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Strategy and Entrepreneurship here at BI, and also leader of the Center for the Construction Industry. This center was established in 2005, and it's not common to have these construction centers at business schools in Norway. But the main idea was that the industry themselves wanted to have a more complementary research community in addition to the traditional engineering, so that we could, with our business school focus, provide research-based knowledge about value creation, about strategic and organizational change, which is the topic for today, and innovation. And there are many different topics related to this, but we have at least 3 key areas that we work on. It's about climate change. We see that that is increasingly being recognized as one of the key. One thing is the mitigation, but also the adaptation to climate change. We are also experiencing much more heavy water falling down, floodings, and what does that mean for our built environment? And what does that mean for the changes that we have to do to cope with this? We are also doing research on more lean construction, but more from an organizational perspective. What does it take to implement a lean construction strategy? And obviously, digital technologies is like a flood into the industry now. Lots of things happening. But again, it's not only about technology, it's also about organizational and social issues. In addition, then, we administer the National Lean Construction Norway network. So we also have lots of contact with companies in different parts of the value chain, from the public and private clients, main contractors, specialists, consultants, architects, and so forth. And they are also involved in this lean construction, even though the name itself incurs some that it is the construction production, but it is broader than that. We are about 15 associate academics here at BI working on construction as the main empirical field, and Norway is a small country, so we also collaborate a lot with the other institutes such as NTNU, the Norwegian Technology and Science University, and SINTEF, the large research institute. So that was a bit of the background. So the situation in the Norwegian sector then. We just recently made an analysis of the architectural, engineering, construction, and real estate that we include in the overall industry label. And there we compared, and we are using accounting data. And then we saw, if you can see this figure, and we see that, of course, oil and gas is by far the largest in terms of value creation in Norway. But the AC and real estate industry comes as a second. When we take out parts of the real estate, it still is on the top 3. So this means that, as in many other countries, the construction sector is very important for the Norwegian economy. It's important in terms of the value creation, obviously, but also in terms of employment. And it's building our built environment. And it's increasingly getting recognized by the government too. Earlier, it was more like, okay, but the construction sector, they deal with this themselves. It's the market and they are there, but it's much more concerned about this as an industry and how can we help improving this industry, because there are obviously some dark clouds. In a recent survey also, CEOs from our 1,500 CEOs throughout the value chain, they reported of great optimism. There are still investments and so on, but also there are some challenges in the future related to, well, decrease in oil prices will eventually also influence the public investments in infrastructure and so forth, and other things. So the key problems, I guess, this is not, this is probably not different from the UK sector and many other sectors, but we see then also in our analysis then of the value creation that many parts of the industry, especially the labor-intensive parts, the construction companies have low margins, nearly only 4%. We have some conflicts going on in the public infrastructure projects that cost a lot. Productivity is always a key concern, even though you could, of course, discuss measurements, methods, and so on, but still it is a concern. And not at least what the CEOs were reporting, that they are concerned about access to talents and that we have the right competence and so on. And it relates to the reputation of the industry. And if the youth are just seeing the bad headlines in the newspaper, well, it's not helping in attracting talents to this industry. So there are some concerns. But things are also happening. Lots of initiatives. As I said, Norway is a small country compared to many other countries. So we have the benefit of having quite, even though the conflict levels, as I said, are rising in some parts of the, such as in the infrastructure projects, it is also a very common idea that we have to collaborate and we have to improve this industry together. And I just wanted to mention two key initiatives then. One is Big Construction 21. It's part of overall industry transformation programs that are going on. So we have Ocean 21, we have Maritime 21, and so forth. And then we have had our construction, or Bygg in Norwegian. And they have made together, gathered lots of people, both academics, industry people, public agencies, and so forth, and made these reports on identifying the best practice about industrialization, business models, digitalization, and collaboration. In addition, there is a new, quite interesting initiative now going on. It's initiated by a big housing association in Oslo, which is now one of the largest clients in Norway. And they have initiated a cluster they call construction cluster that is also connected then to a big transformation project where one of these traditional industry areas in Oslo is being transformed. And many of these companies now are going together, being co-located and having their headquarters in this area. And we are also part. You can see our logo, the BI. So it also includes academics. So what is the problem? Well, we have painted a picture that there are some challenges, there are some great initiatives and so on. But what is really the key problem? And what we hear when we ask the managers and also go around with our industry partners is this can summarize what is their key concern. They say that, well, our challenge is not the lack of good ideas and ambitions. There are lots of things happening, inventions and so on, and great ambitions, but challenge is to scale these, to accelerate the change that we have to go through. So it's the scaling, and which we then associate with organizational transformation processes. We have many different research programs, but I just wanted to mention one of them that has been very important for us to understand organizational change processes. And it is about implementing lean construction strategies. And it's one of the largest construction firms in Norway that we have worked together with for 15 years. And we have seen that as they started looking into lean construction as a way of improving construction processes, we have followed this process now for 10, 15 years and seen that there is a connection between the role of middle managers as mediators between what is happening in the projects and up to the headquarters. The projects themselves, project managers, are also very good sites for an important learning arenas. The headquarters are trying to align all this to the overall strategy, but it is also important that they are supporting and prioritizing among all these ideas that is happening. We as researchers have then the role of, we are involved as to create what I call the chain of evidence to prove that, okay, what is actually working and not, reporting on these processes that are going on, connecting it to previous research and so on. And then we have these networks where the knowledge experiences are communicated, further developed and taken into other organizations. So this whole, I think this research program on lean construction is a very nice example of the different roles played, of course, by the company and different parts of the project-based organization itself, but also we as researchers and a kind of network of other companies. Because here it has been a very in the lean construction environment in Norway and headed then by this construction company, which is Veidekke, for those of you familiar with the Norwegian construction sector. It has been very open. We say that, okay, we cannot do this alone. We have to do this together. And also because we have the same suppliers, the same, more or less the same supply chains. So we have to improve together. So it has been a very openness. So then what have we learned throughout these years? And this just captures some of the key issues that we have identified being important for change, both in this project, but also in many other research programs. And these are not necessarily in this order, but I will show it later, illustrating the cycle of these steps. And what we have seen, and perhaps it's not like rocket science, but this awareness and preparedness of what is actually going to happen, and why are we actually doing this? Why are we changing? Why is this a kind of joint problem in the organization, but also overall in the industry? So in terms of signaling, and this can be on different levels, from top management levels to the kind of basic management level on the construction site, signaling and also legitimizing that, okay, this is something that we need to do. And then this common understanding that everyone is talking about, because there are different understandings, there are different perceptions of what we are talking about, what it takes, and so on, and having these social learning processes. Often companies establish competence networks, learning networks, project managers meet every second month and so on, just to communicate and create this common understanding. And then, of course, allowing for experimenting. We see that in all the kind of projects and companies where change is kind of successful, it is also a culture for allowing to test out and try things, learning by doing and so on, and experimenting. And then this chain of evidence where we as researchers also play an important role, but also the company itself, because that is often the challenge, is that you do many things and then you don't necessarily know what were the reason for the effects. So this chain of evidence between cause and effect is something that is happening through evaluation and the reporting then. And then the final stage, enabling institutionalizing through this embedding in practice. And Sam was also mentioning this, that increasingly this is done via digital tools and so on. And of course that change the competitive advantage, for example. There are some things then, just summarize, that, well, it's not like you can decide things to happen. You can facilitate to establish some structures, incentive systems. You can establish these networks, for example, but it is this mix of the interventions that you as managers can do and allowing for these social learning processes to happen. And of course, these change processes are conditioned by several issues. And I will come back to this final slide and just illustrating how we think about this. So when a problem or a new initiative, new idea, and as I said, this can come from different levels. It's not necessarily from the top management level. It can also happen on the construction site, in the projects. They are the closest to the customers. So something happens, but then this creating an awareness of that this is something that we need to do. The why is important. And then further common understanding, experimentation, chain of evidence, and the institutionalization, and then it goes and goes, because these processes never stop somehow. They continue and take different forms. And then it is the structural interventions, social learning processes, and some key conditions. Legitimization, involvement of right people. What we often see is the key is to prepare people for taking in the change and changing, training, competence development, and so forth. So it is the mix of these three overall elements then. So I think I will leave it with that and hope for some good questions, discussions, so we can take this further. But at least I have tried to paint a picture of how we think about the need for transforming organizational practices related to the overall change process that we are witnessing now with business models and so forth. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lena. That was great, and there was two really interesting talks, complementary in many ways, with different international perspectives as well from both of the speakers, from Sam and Lena. We're now going to move over to the Q&A, and please we have lots of questions coming in already, but please do keep sending in your questions, and we'll see if we can get through some of them. There's a general question for both of you to start off. Given the fragmented nature of construction as an industry, and the very large number of small and medium-sized enterprises, which organisation is going to lead the transformation of the sector, do you think? And what do they need to do to ensure that it happens? I'll start with Sam.
That's a good question, Andy. I suppose I'm not sure if it'll be like one organisation that leads it. I think one interesting thing that I took away from Daniel's presentation the other week was the amount of venture capital that's coming into this industry now. He wrote in more detail about this in the industrialised construction white paper, and you know, I think that this industry is at big risk of disruption. So you got a lot of external money coming in, a lot of people from other sectors coming in, and they're looking to shake things up. So I'm not sure whether existing companies are going to be able to get around that fragmentation. I think it's going to be a real challenge because, you know, if they're going to, you got to come up with a reason for if they're going to do it, why haven't they done it already? So one of those reasons might be a lack of capital. Maybe there's more capital coming into the industry. The other one might be technological. So, you know, the standardization and digitization of interfaces between different systems, it might get a lot easier for them to talk and to bridge that fragmentation. But I think it's a real open question, and I'm not sure there's an easy answer. I think the most interesting organisation I've seen recently in the sector is Autodesk. I think it's quite interesting looking at how they're trying to orchestrate an ecosystem around their products, like we often see in other sectors, like the automobile sector now. So you look at it, autonomous vehicles. There's a lot of that going on, and traditionally within software, so like operating systems like Android versus the Apple ecosystem, the OS X ecosystem. So I can see, I think if I was going to watch anyone and think that one firm might make a big impact, I think it might be Autodesk.
Lena, your views?
Yeah, I agree with Sam in a sense that I don't think it will be one single organization, but there will be some motors, I think, driving the change. And here I think also there are some differences between Norway and perhaps UK, not at least, but we see that in fact many of our public clients are not only being the traditional demanding customers, and that is driving the development because the market reacts, but we also see that many of the public clients are in fact driving the development within new collaborative delivery forms, such as the governmental or the public agency for hospital buildings in Norway, and also within digitalization. The government's main advisor, Statsbygg, main advisor for building and building commissioner, they have also been driving very much the kind of use and implementation of BIM in Norway. So we see that many of these public clients is in fact motors together with some of the big construction companies and so forth. But I think what we will see is what we have seen in other industries, that it's not this company against company, but supply chains against supply chains, and perhaps even this competition, that competitors are in fact collaborating in many respects, such as we see in the Construction City initiative in Norway. So I think that it will be much more, even though the industry is becoming more fragmented, but well, we will see. I think we will see much more networking, alliancing, and even vertical integration. So, yeah.
Okay, I've got a question here which is quite a challenging one, interesting one for both of you. Do you have any sense of any toxic routines that might be really difficult to shift in organizations and so prevent change? Sam, we'll go for you first.
Oh, I was going to say, that sounds like Lena's the expert on that one.
I know, but I'll let you go.
Okay, so I'll give you two quick ones. So in terms of my area of expertise being innovation, I think the industry's seen a lot of mantra over the years, like innovation's awesome. We need to do more innovation. So it's like a whole lot of people singing around and chanting to each other, but very little method. And I see people talk about innovation, but then they don't want to create an R&D budget. So I was just talking to a colleague last night in the industry, and who's an innovation leader, and he's just talking about the work he's had to do to end up getting a cost code for innovation in his large firm. And it's an amazing success, but it's taken a year and a half, and you don't see that very often. So I think there's a lot of, in terms of something that's toxic, I think it's this whole mantra over concrete actions. In terms of on the construction side, I think I'd leave it to Bob Sutton, who wrote that great book called The No Arsehole Rule. I think arseholes are very difficult to get rid of, but I'll let Lena be the authority on this one.
Well, I think that almost all routines might have the potential of being toxic if they're not working anymore, but they are hard to change, especially if they are embedded into structures and systems and kind of the overall culture. So in that respect, it could be toxic, no matter what type of routine you're talking about. But what we think, especially because we have been studying this large implementation processes taking on 15 years and so on, and the question is, okay, will you have that time now in the next phase of the transformation that we are going through? How can they accelerate? So what we see is that there are many incremental changes that have been going on, that you're just improving already the existing practices, existing routines, making them more efficient. But how do you let routines die? How do you kill routines? So I think my answer would be that all routines might have the potential of being toxic.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very helpful. A question for both of you, another one. Thank you very much for a very interesting, insightful presentations. Have you observed the not invented here resistance to new ways of working or ideas that is prevalent in the UK project-based firms? If so, have you any tactics that could be successful in overcoming these problems?
Yes. So yeah, there's been a huge amount of scholarship that's looked into not invented here syndrome, what triggers it, and I can talk a little bit about that briefly. One of the things that's also interesting is there's also a trend, an equally pernicious trend, towards the opposite, so that people actually value ideas more if they come from outside the firm rather than inside the firm. So anyone interested in that, drop me an email and I can send you a reading list. But in short, one of the things that you can do to try and deal with the not invented here syndrome is to, first of all, affirmate that let's say Andy comes to me with an idea. I want to go to Andy with an idea and tell him, hey, Andy, I found this amazing new algorithm that'll do a great, offer a great improvement to your work. And I'm worried Andy's going to turn around and tell me to get stuffed because he comes up with all the best recipes and algorithms in my firm. What I'd start off by doing is affirmating that Andy's existing contributions and telling him what is an amazing job that Andy does and how I really like all these amazing things he's done. And I found this one excellent thing that might be able to cumulatively advance what he's doing. So you give people, it's actually a whole lot of social psychology on it. Give them an opportunity to self-affirmate first, and then you ask them to sort of do something that threatens their identity or their sense of self afterwards, and they're more likely to do it. That's at the individual level. In terms of the organizational industry levels, is sort of a much more longer story, but feel free to drop me an email.
Lena?
Yeah, we have definitely seen it. That's for sure. And perhaps you're right, Sam. Often we also, I think, experience that it's more the not invented here syndrome within large organizations. That, okay, up in the north of Norway, they are so special and they have some special conditions and so on, so it doesn't fit. And that is a main barrier for this organizational learning within an organization. So it's much more openness for external in some ways. So I think it is what we have also seen in this organizational change process and the cycle that I showed is that it's about legitimization, but it is like it's a balance between someone doing something very special and it's being communicated and so on, but it is to a certain extent that is received very well. In the first place, they think this is interesting and so on, but then it seems like, oh, it's always they who are being invited to do the speech on the annual meeting and so on. So people get a bit tired. And perhaps it's also about, could be attributed to the engineering spirit that you want to be creative and make up your own things and don't want, and it is a special setting. So yeah.
Sorry, just came to me one thing to add on that, Andy. I just remembered, and Lena, what Lena was saying reminded me. On Crossrail, when we were helping them develop the innovation strategy, I remember that was a real challenge. And one of the things that, and you know, so I remember I was talking to Mark Thurston and the guys about this at the time, Tim DeBarro, and saying, well, you know, one of the things that, you know, this is going to be a challenge. How do we deal with it? And came up with this idea of pinched with pride. And so the idea that you'd actually celebrate the fact that other sites, or think about if your organisation, either project sites or departments in the firm, would steal ideas from each other, or, you know, take them and repurpose them and reuse them, and actually make that a point of celebration. So to try and combat, like what Lena was saying, this sort of tendency of engineers to really only celebrate these original divine acts of creation, rather than reappropriation and cumulatively leveraging what everyone's doing.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. We'll move on to the next question. We'll start this time with Lena. The person who's asking this question was at Digital Construction Week, and there was a lot of talk about digital disruption. What do you understand by this, and how do you think it will and is impacting on construction?
I think it also relates to a comment I had earlier about this incremental, just improving existing processes versus implementing new ones, and also letting some existing processes die and being replaced. So I think with the digital transformation, we see at least three different types of digitalization for improving existing ways of working, digitalization or new digital processes, for example, or new tools that are more add-ons, helpful, solving things that you couldn't do earlier. And it is the digital transformation that will completely change the way we are doing construction work. And perhaps we are not there yet, but with automation, robots and so on, perhaps you're seeing at least what this can be in the future. But I still think, based on the research that we have done, still it is more in the first phases that, okay, we are now, of course, we have been using digital tools for a long time, but now we are finding new ways of using them. But this huge digital transformation where we really put everything upside down, it's yet to be seen, at least here in Norway.
Thanks. Sam?
Okay, funnily enough, I had a slide on this originally, and I chopped it out for time. So my first thing, at the risk of being an academic, was I'd suggest you go have a, oh, that's not going to come up. The Disruption Dilemma by Josh Gans. It's a fantastic book that really goes into the academic literature, but in a very practical and accessible and informative way around what disruption is and why it matters, how firms deal with it. I think most of the time when I see people using the word disruption, it's because they're trying to sell something. So they're trying to create fear in a company or a person that they're going to get eaten alive by some new upstart. There's been a lot of research into this, and what often happens is that most large companies respond quite successfully, as Josh Gans shows, to the threat of, so incumbents respond quite successfully through the threat of disruption. Now, he's got a nice definition of what disruption is, and he calls it when firms fail because they continue to make the choices that made them successful in the face of technological change. So, you know, the steam engine, you made all these choices and decisions about how you configure your factory around the steam engine. Electricity comes along and you think you'll plug and play it. You don't change the architecture of the building. You don't change the way you don't change the people you employ and how you train them. Those are the firms that are at risk of disruption. So I'm not sure if that completely nails the question, but hopefully it gives you a sense of where I think that conversation's heading.
That's great. Thank you very much, both of you. This is a more specific question, but I think it's got kind of wider implications. Is there a need to rethink how the commercial management of large construction projects is done? And then there's a more specific point to this. Historically, earned value management has been used extensively. In my experience, the person writes, this has led to issues where short-term progress is prioritized over what's best for the long-term outcome of the project. Lena, would you like to think about that first?
I think it's a very important and interesting question, because this is also some related to change and new business models and the way you think about the projects and the value they make, and how you could also continue to make and be involved in that value creation even though the project is finished. So I think yourself, Andy, have done a lot about these system integrators and so on, that you add on services to the product, so you take on ownership for a longer time, and also with your PPP projects and so on, where you're actually running and operating the infrastructure or the building for 20 years. So we see that already, but to be honest, it still doesn't fly in Norway, at least, but I think it will be coming. Yeah, it's yet to be seen.
So I suppose I'm not an expert on earned value management, but one of the things that one of the big sort of macro level shifts I see is hopefully in the conversation too. So there's been this ongoing conversation about value versus cost, and you see it in the rhetoric. You see large major projects being talked in the media about, this is an X billion-dollar project, and they're talking about the cost, not the value that's being created. And I think that we're totally missing that point. When we miss that point at this sort of superficial national level and international level in these conversations about these projects, those ways we think about things and we value things and flow down to the coalface. I think what's interesting in the industry now is you're seeing a whole lot of unconventional players getting in, whether that's IKEA and Skanska, Amazon, Muji in Japan. There's a lot of untraditional players who are very interested in products traditionally, who I think probably have some very different ideas about how they're going to capture value from the built environment than what traditional players have in mind. So I think that I don't think that the let's say the civil engineering community, construction engineering community on its own is ever going to reach a resolution on things like earned value. But I think what's ultimately going to happen is you've got these new firms that are going to be coming in, and they're going to be making big bets on where they think the value is to be created and backing them. So yeah, I think things like Amazon thinking, right, well, we're going to rewire we're going to provide you a discount to buy these new prefabricated panels that are pre-installed with smart home appliances, and we're going to capture value out of essentially the way you use this stuff. And I think it's sort of dystopian and terrifying in many ways, but I think these are the experiments that are going on.
Great, thanks both of you. So we've got time for one last question, which we'll start with Lena first. What are the main knowledge gaps in this upcoming construction industry transformation regarding construction management? What should we be aware of, and what should we worry about?
Well, what shouldn't you be worried about, I would say, in some way. It's difficult to pinpoint the one type of competence or knowledge gap, but I'm biased here, I must say, but I don't think technology will be the most difficult part. I think this organizational change processes, the fact that we have fragmentation not only in the industry but also within these, at least the large companies, I think that will be a main focus. I was about to say people, but still it is much about how you drive these change processes involving people to accelerate this change process that we will have to take. So yeah.
Okay, Sam?
Yeah, I think Lena and I are probably in agreement, and I suppose it's not surprising that you ask hammers what they think is going to be coming and they say nails, but I think it's very much around business models. So I think the gap in the industry, very much around thinking through what is a business model, how do they change, What's the delivery model? What are the different dimensions? Because as you and I have talked about many times, Andy, and I know Lena's engaged with these ideas as well, like the industry talks a lot about delivery models, but then if you ask everybody what they are, they all have these different understandings, these different operationalizations. So I think that adjusting to things like technical change really requires you have a deep understanding of your business model and your delivery model, and then also the practical knowledge about how you can change them. That's where I see the big knowledge gaps. But as I said, I'm a hammer who sees nails, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, we're going to have to end it there, but I do want to thank both of the speakers, Sam and Lena, for giving us such insightful, thoughtful, and provoking talks. Really grateful for that. And thanks everyone for attending and sending in your questions. This has been really good. A recording, as we had in the past, will be available soon, so you'll be able to see that on the website. And also, could you please, the participants, not Sam and Lena, complete the survey of the event, of the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Lena.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for hosting.